Welcome to part 4 in my series exploring the Mac Pro 6.1 trash can and whether it makes sense for a Pro user in 2020. In this episode I'm going to be exploring the real-world performance of the Mac Pro and I'll draw some conclusions. If you've got two similar components that you want to compare, or two systems you want to compare against each other, then a benchmark may be the way to go because it gives you a consistent and repeatable point of reference, something you can measure against. Benchmarks are also really good at showing you the limits of performance on a system or a component, but they're not quite as good at showing you what real-world usage is going to be like. Now, for example, many of the tasks that we use our computers for on a daily basis just don't require the CPU to be maxed out. So the fact that one CPU performs better than another might be less relevant. In fact, it's true to say that a system might benchmark worse than another system, but turn out to be faster for some individual tasks. We also need to consider how important raw performance actually is. Does it matter to you if Microsoft Word takes an extra couple of seconds to open up? Provided that once it's open, the computer is responsive, it feels snappy to use, and it doesn't get in the way of you actually doing your work. You know, the window of acceptable performance for these things can be fairly wide. In many cases, we buy computers with way more performance than we actually need, simply because of the way they're marketed to us. We see the numbers and we want the biggest number. We don't want to have an inferior product, regardless of the fact of whether we could actually use the performance. A good example of this is the Mac Pro 2019, or in fact any workstation computer. You quite often see these spec'd out with huge amounts of RAM, and in most cases, most people will never get to use more than 64 gigabytes of RAM. It's an interesting challenge to try if you have got a computer with that much memory and see if you can get it to use all the memory in a real-world usage scenario. For most people, it just doesn't happen. And yet, we go out and buy these things, and I'm guilty of that as well. I've got 64 gigabytes in the Mac Pro. I'm probably never going to use anything like that much memory. Now, Apple is really good at this. They'll release a new generation of a product that's really nothing more than a minor iteration on the previous generation. But if you own the previous generation product, how does that make you feel? Well, suddenly you feel like your equipment is out of date and that it needs to be upgraded. And this is complete nonsense. The truth is, the previous generation equipment has probably still got way more performance than you actually need to do your job. An interesting exercise is to think back to the computer that you had 10 or 20 years ago and think of a simple task like, say, writing a letter. Can you perform that task any faster on the computer that's on your desk today? I suspect in most cases the answer is probably not. And the reason for that is that as computers have become more powerful, software becomes more bloated or feature-rich. It takes advantage of all of those additional resources. And the weakest link then, in most cases, is us, the user. So for that reason, the only way to really properly assess the real-world performance of a computer is to actually use it on a daily basis. Now, unfortunately, most companies selling equipment are not giving out their equipment for 30-day free trials. And so we have to base our decisions on benchmarks and on YouTube reviews. So I felt that an episode on real-world usage might be useful to some of you. At least it might help you if your use case is similar to mine. I've been using the Mac Pro 6.1 as my daily driver for roughly the last month or so. So I've been using it for office tasks. You know, I work in some fairly heavyweight Excel spreadsheets managing my business, so I've just been using it for that, and daily email and web browsing. I've done some video editing on it, I've done some photo editing on it, and I've even done a bit of music composition in Logic Pro. And I feel like at the end of all of this, I've got a fairly good idea of how this computer performs and whether or not it's suitable for me or a user like me. I'd always wanted one of these Mac Pros. I just like the design of it. I know that many people don't. I do. That's just me. And I got the opportunity to buy one of these cheap and I thought, well, let's try it out. And it'd be an interesting project to make a video series about. And when I started out, I hadn't made a decision on whether or not I would be keeping the Mac Pro 6.1. In fact, my expectation was that I would be selling it at the end of this video process. Now, the fact that you can see it on the desk behind me, or perhaps you can, it's behind the monitor there, and my iMac is gone, that probably gives you a fairly big clue as to what my final decision was. But it wasn't as cut and dried as you might think. So let's start with my real-world experience. And first of all, with the boot up time of the computer. That's the first thing you do, isn't it? On a daily basis, you switch your computer on. How long before you're in the operating system? Well, in my case, somewhere around 20 seconds. And that's fine. I'm not going to compare that to other computers. I know there are other computers that boot up faster. Certainly my MacBook Pro boots up a bit quicker than that. But honestly, 20 seconds, that's fine. I'm always making a coffee anyway after I've just switched on the power switch, so I don't have any issue with that. One thing I have noticed with the Mac Pro is that it doesn't seem to recognise the resolution of my 4K Dell monitor when it's booting up. So the Apple logo ends up being very low resolution and sort of stretched on the screen. I don't really understand why that should be the case. I'm connecting the monitor via DisplayPort cable. It should work fine, but it doesn't. When it comes to displays and resolutions, obviously the iMac I had the glorious 5K display in it, and I wanted something really good to go with the Mac Pro 6.1. I couldn't quite stretch to the 5K monitor, so I went for the Dell 32-inch 4K resolution monitor that you can see behind me. This is from Dell's Ultra Sharp range. You'll see these monitors in all of my videos. We've kitted out our web studio completely with Dell Ultra Sharps. They come out of the box 99% color calibrated. So whilst they wouldn't be appropriate for someone who's doing color critical work, for someone like me that runs a web studio, they're absolutely ideal. Now getting back to the performance of the Mac Pro. Once you get into the desktop, everything feels really snappy. The performance is great. I don't feel like it lags at any point or that the computer gets in the way of what I'm trying to do. You can move windows around, open apps and close apps and switch virtual desktops. You can copy files. Everything's just very smooth and very easy to use. Now I do also use my MacBook Pro 13-inch with this monitor via the Razer eGPU that you can see behind me, and that's kitted out with a 5700 XT graphics card, and that combination really flies, but that's a subject for another video. Now of course the MacBook Pro would benchmark well ahead of the Mac Pro for single core performance, for SSD performance, for probably RAM performance as well, and once it's plugged into that eGPU then it will be better for GPU performance too. And yet in the real world there doesn't really feel like there's a lot of difference between the two from using the desktop. Sure, if you put them side by side, you probably would notice the MacBook Pro is a little bit quicker, a little bit more responsive, but that's not to say that using the Mac Pro feels in any way substandard. Where you do notice the difference is when you start to get to resource-hungry websites. And a good example of this would be the online versions of Microsoft Office. You know, these things are heavyweight web applications and they use a lot of system resources. And certainly you do notice that the Mac Pro is slower than the MacBook Pro, for example. That's not to say that it's so slow that it becomes unusable. Again, it's completely fine, it feels fine, but it's just a little bit more noticeable than other day-to-day tasks. I think that's just a product of the older technology in the Mac Pro. You know, ultimately this stuff dates from 2013, although Apple was still making the Mac Pro long past that. But even in 2013, the components that are inside this computer weren't exactly cutting edge at that point. It's understandable then that nearly 10 years later, it's showing its age a little bit with some of the latest technology. Now I've done some video editing with this Mac Pro in Final Cut Pro. It works fine for the kind of work that I do. Now Apple updated Final Cut Pro recently to take advantage of all the hardware that's in the new Mac Pro 2019. And a lot of Mac users of different types of Macs have noticed a performance increase in Final Cut Pro. But sadly, the Mac Pro 6.1 is not one of those Macs. They seem to have cobbled the performance. It's much worse than it used to be. When you look at GPU usage during background renders, what you notice is that the computer is not making full use of the power of the GPUs. I don't understand why that is, but it means that background rendering is slower than it should be. I've actually got to the point where I just switch off background rendering and the computer is powerful enough to just work with the footage without having that background rendered version. Now I'm not doing anything particularly complex. A lot of my videos are recorded on a Panasonic G9 camera, 4K resolution, 25 frames per second and 8-bit color. I take that 4K video into the timeline and then I can use that to crop in on different things because I always output 1080p at 25 frames per second and send it to YouTube. So for my use case, this computer's got plenty of power to edit video. And it's not completely dissimilar to the iMac 27-inch that it replaces. That had the quad-core i5 non-hyper-threaded processor in it, and it had the 580 graphics. Now, if you've watched the earlier episodes, you'll know that I bought the Mac Pro from my own company as we were getting to the point where we were ready to dispose of it, because we'd replaced it with an i9 iMac, the top of the range one with the Vega 48 graphics. So I know quite a lot about this machine, and I know the designer who was using it on a daily basis. And he was using it for editing in Final Cut Pro before he switched over onto the i9 iMac. And in his view, at that time, the iMac didn't seem to be a massive performance upgrade to him. Obviously, the i9 iMac does the final render much faster. But of course, he was talking about a version of Final Cut Pro before Apple did these updates for the new Mac Pro 2019. I'll put the exact version number up on the screen where things changed. So prior to that change, this computer had more performance in Final Cut Pro from what I've seen. And since that change, it's had less performance. So if you're considering buying one of these Mac Pro 6.1s for video editing with Final Cut Pro, you should definitely take this into account, that the current version is not well optimized for this specific machine. And whether or not Apple are going to change that, well, you've got to hedge your bets. Now, I'm sure some of you are curious as to whether or not I've tried connecting the eGPU to the Mac Pro 6.1. And the answer is yes, I have, and I've got it working, and it does work. It works just fine. In fact, it absolutely romps through various benchmarks and is great for playing games and things like that. So obviously I tried it with Final Cut Pro. And you can set the 5700 XT graphics card as the background renderer, but Final Cut Pro just ignores that. And what it seems to do instead is just use one of the D300s for doing the background rendering. So the end result is that it actually is slower in Final Cut Pro if you connect the eGPU. This doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, and clearly there's something a little bit weird going on. I'm told that it used to work fine before Apple changed these versions. These are not issues that are specific to me, by the way. There's a number of online forums where other users are saying they've got exactly the same problems, and not just with the Mac Pro 6.1, with other older Macs as well. Now, as I'm recording this, just a few days ago, Apple released version 10.15.4 of macOS. That doesn't fix any of these eGPU problems, just in case you were wondering. Now, I've not done any tests in DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere Pro. I do have access to both of those applications, but I've never used them before. And unfortunately, time just ran away with me with all the other things that are going on, and I didn't have time to do a little bit of learning to figure out how to use those packages. And I'd hate to give you bad information due to me not knowing what I'm doing. I'm quite keen on learning DaVinci Resolve, so I'm going to put a little bit of time into that. Once I'm up to a reasonable level, then I'll do a comparison video at that point. But what I would imagine is that the experience in editing video will be broadly similar to what I've experienced in Final Cut Pro, in that I'm fairly certain that DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro don't do background rendering. So it would be like using Final Cut Pro with background rendering switched off, which is exactly what I've been doing. Now, render times, of course, will vary. And this is where we're getting back into the realms of benchmarks again. And that's going to be really important if you're rendering out lots of videos. If you're doing one after the other, then you want a computer that can chew through that stuff. For me, I'm not doing that kind of volume, so I'll set the thing rendering and go off and enjoy a cup of coffee. So it just doesn't matter to me how good the render performance is. A Mac Pro 6.1, at least one equipped with the D300s like mine is not going to set the world alight when it comes to video editing, and it's probably not going to float the boat of any serious professional video editor. But for prosumers and enthusiasts, amateurs, this computer is going to be just fine for the type of content that you'll be processing and invariably uploading to YouTube. Now, if you are a video professional and you're working with 10-bit or even 12-bit color and 6K and 8K resolutions, then this computer is not suitable for you. But then you already know that, because the kind of money that you're spending out on equipment that can do those kind of resolutions and color depths is going to dwarf the price of this Mac Pro and actually make Apple's new Mac Pro 2019 seemed like good value. If you're a serious video producer and that's your main job, then you need to have a tool that's suitable for that. I don't think the Mac Pro 6.1 is suitable for that now in 2020. Let's move on to an application that doesn't rely on GPU and that could actually make use of all of those processor cores that we've got in the Mac Pro, and that's professional audio. We're going to have a look at Logic Pro X. I play guitar and I like to record music, and I've used Logic a lot to do that over the years. I think it's fair to say, though, I haven't done much in the last couple of years. Business has really kind of taken away my available time. So it's fair to say I'm a little bit rusty with Logic Pro. And I think it's also fair to say that any of my compositions are not going to get anywhere near taxing the 12 CPU cores on this Mac Pro. What I have found is that anything that I've loaded up runs perfectly. The app is very smooth to use, the performance is absolutely fantastic, but then it should be. A lot of my older compositions were done on a dual-core Mac Mini and they worked okay on there. So I'd absolutely expect the Mac Pro to chew through this stuff. So in order to properly test it, I am going to need to resort to some sort of benchmark file. And there are a few places on the internet where you can find these files that you can run into Logic, and it'll just use up as much resource as possible and you can see how much your computer will take. And I think for this one test it would be useful to also test the MacBook Pro. It's fully kitted out with Logic just like the Mac Pro. I'm going to download a benchmark file and we'll just run the test and we'll see how they compare. So this is the bit where we do the Logic audio test, and I'm filming this the day after the previous bit of video that you've just been watching. Now, in order to test Logic, I'm downloading a benchmark file from a website called music-prod.com. Now, the way this works is that you have a Logic project file with loads and loads of software instrument tracks. They're all identical to each other using the same software instrument and just playing an ascending scale. Nothing too exciting, and it's put on a loop. And the idea is that you just switch on the channels until your computer can't cope anymore. Now, in order to set this up, you first have to go into your audio preferences and change your buffer sample size to 1024. So I've done that already. I've put up on screen the CPU watcher so that we can see all of the 24 cores in the system. Now, obviously that's hyper-threaded cores, so there's only 12 cores on the actual processor, but because it's hyper-threaded, it shows us 24. So we're going to have that on the screen so we can see how the usage increases as we go. Now I'm going to be screen recording using QuickTime. So obviously that will consume a small amount of system resources. So the result that I get may be just slightly different to the result that you might get. And once we finish, we're going to test it again on the MacBook Pro that I've got here as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just clear the CPU history, then I'm going to press play and I'll just start enabling tracks until the thing stops. Okay, so we're running at 75 tracks at the moment. And now we're up to 85. And you can see from the CPU usage that it's starting to use up quite a lot of the processing power of this Mac Pro. And I think we can go a little bit further. There's 100, and it's still going quite happily. You can see that the usage on the cores is really bumping up though now. So that's 110, and I've noticed that the temperature is starting to climb inside the system. We're up to 42 degrees now. I think what I'll do is we'll just push it a little bit more. So there we go, it managed 115 tracks before the system overload message came up. What I'll do now is I'll just switch the screen recorder off and we'll try the test again just to see if we can push it any higher than 115 without that QuickTime overhead. Well, don't know how well you can see that, but we're running 115 tracks and it is playing, but the CPU cores do look fairly maxed out. I'll keep adding a few more tracks. And actually I just got the system overload message again, so perhaps QuickTime wasn't using quite so much resource as I thought. So about 115 tracks then on the Mac Pro. Now what does that actually mean? We really need a comparison to be able to understand this result. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut down the Mac Pro and I'm going to get my MacBook Pro 13-inch set up, and then we'll see how that does. Just for comparison purposes, this is the 2018 version. It's got the 2.7 GHz quad-core i7, and that's a hyper-threaded processor, so we'll see 8 cores on the CPU monitor. It's got 16 GB of RAM. It's also got a 1 TB SSD. I don't expect that'll make any difference to this particular test. So we're all set up to go. I'll set the screen recorder going, I'll clear the CPU history, and then we'll start the test at, say, 25 tracks, and we'll see how we get on. So we're currently at 40 tracks, and as you can see, the CPU load is already quite high. And there we go, we got to 50 tracks before we got the system overload window up. So let me just switch this around and then I'll come back to you with my thoughts. So that's the audio test done. Interesting result. The Mac Pro managed 115 of those software instruments simultaneously, and the MacBook Pro 13-inch just 50. Although actually that's quite a good result, it would seem. On the website that I downloaded the benchmark from, it gives some example performance for different systems. And the best performing system is that i9 27-inch iMac that we keep referring to. And that managed 125 tracks. So the top of the range consumer iMac is just slightly ahead of this Mac Pro when it comes to audio performance. They also give some other machines there. There's also the 27-inch iMac that I used to have with the quad-core i5. That managed just 27 tracks. A MacBook Pro 15-inch from 2018 with the 2.2 GHz i7, that managed 67 tracks. And then we go down to the MacBook Pro 13-inch with the i5 from 2016. That managed just 14 tracks. And the MacBook Air 13-inch with an i5 from 2018, 3 tracks. I think that example of the MacBook Air really serves to underline the point I'm making about benchmarks not giving a good idea of real-world performance. You see, that MacBook Air scored just 3 software instruments at once, whereas the Mac Pro manages 115. So does that mean the Mac Pro is 38 times faster than a MacBook Air? Well, of course it isn't. And if you've got one of those 2018 MacBook Airs, you know full well that in sort of everyday tasks it's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It feels perfectly quick to use. So most of the performance that's available in the Mac Pro, most of us would never actually get to use it. So as I say, an interesting test. And now back to the me of yesterday to continue with the video. So I'm impressed with this 12-core Mac Pro 6,1 when it comes to audio. And I think many audio professionals would find this computer to be perfectly adequate for their day-to-day work. And the Mac Pro 6,1 does have an ace up its sleeve when it comes to audio. It is really quiet. But that ace turns into a bit of a failing in other areas. It seems that it's so quiet because Apple was very conservative when it came to programming the fan curves for cooling this thing. And it's fair to say that because of the unified thermal design in this computer, things get a bit toasty. In fact, my Mac Pro had a complete meltdown. So I was editing a video in Final Cut Pro, and at the same time I was downloading the instrument library and installing it for Logic Pro. I don't know if you've ever done that before, but it is absolutely huge, something like 60 gigabytes of download. And it does seem to be quite resource intensive when it's installing all of this stuff. Obviously it's writing to the SSD, so that was getting a bit warm. Final Cut Pro is heating up the GPUs and the processor, everything's getting toasty. And of course, because of the design of the Mac Pro 6,1, where all of these devices are sharing a heatsink, everything gets very hot very fast. And the fan didn't spin up, and the computer crashed. And then it went into a loop of crashing. And not even doing the usual Mac kind of, your computer had a problem, that black screen that you get up. It just kept crashing, rebooting, crashing, rebooting. I switched off the power and I could feel the heat radiating from the computer. I got a bit panicky, I'll be honest. So for the second time, I had to take this Mac Pro 6.1 completely to pieces. In the process of doing that, I just checked the thermal paste on the CPU. I've been quite worried since I did the upgrade that I put on either too little or too much, and it turns out that actually the amount I put on was just fine. There was nice even coverage and not too much spillover. Nonetheless, because I'd taken it off, I cleaned all of that off and reapplied it. And then I took off the two GPUs and reapplied thermal paste to those. Now the thermal paste on the GPUs was long since expired. It had gone all hard and crusty, so it probably wasn't doing anything at all. So I should have done it when I originally took the Mac Pro apart, and I'm kicking myself for not doing it. But it has been done now. Whether or not there was any lasting damage done to the machine, I can't tell you. Now after I'd reapplied the thermal paste, I put it all back together and booted up, and the computer was just doing all sorts of odd stuff. The SSD was throttled at something like 500 megabytes per second. The operating system was sluggish. It was doing strange things. It kept crashing, giving kernel panics. I was getting to the point where I just wanted to throw the thing out of the window, actually, if I'm honest. I decided then that actually, no, probably what I should do is a complete fresh system restore. Now when I got the Mac Pro, it had Mojave on it, and I did a Catalina upgrade and I didn't do a fresh install. And since that time I changed the CPU, changed the RAM, then I changed the SSD, which involved cloning it onto a separate drive and then cloning it back. I've also been fiddling about with the eGPU, which requires installing kernel extensions and other things. So it sort of occurred to me that actually I probably got a bit of a mess going on here, and a fresh install might just help things out. So I did a completely fresh install using the restore from the internet function, and I completely wiped the SSD and started from scratch. And since I did that, the computer has been reliable. It has had 2 kernel panics since then, but we're talking about over a period of maybe 2 weeks. I still don't find that acceptable, and there's obviously something not quite right, and I'll keep looking into that. But it's not GPUs overheating that's causing that. Now to protect myself from the overheating issue again and the fan just not spinning up adequately, I found this application called TG Pro. And this is quite a neat little app. It doesn't cost very much money, and it shows you all of the temperatures across your system, and it allows you to program the fan to come on at certain temperatures, so you can make the decision of how you want your system cooled. So I've put in quite an aggressive policy into that, so the fans will spin up a lot sooner than they would otherwise. And that's keeping the system between 40 and 50 degrees C, and that's pretty good. For a workstation like this, that's where you want your thermal performance to be. Now that does mean, of course, that the fan comes on sooner and it makes noise, so that's not so good for the audio that we were just talking about. But of course with TG Pro, I can turn it off at any time and I'm in complete control over that, so I think that's a good addition to the system. If you're buying one of these computers, wherever you're getting it from, you're probably going to need to think about taking it apart and applying thermal paste just to make sure it's in good condition, and also to clean it out. If you remember when I did that video, it was absolutely filthy and clogged up with dust in there. So well worth doing that exercise if you feel confident in doing it. Take it apart, clean it, reapply thermal paste. And just remember too that my computer is the one with the D300s. If you've got one with the D500s or the D700s, things have the potential to get even hotter. So do pay attention to that. So let's move on to another Pro application, and that is editing photos. Now I used to use Adobe Lightroom for this, but I just can't stand Adobe's subscription model. It drives me up the wall. So a couple of years ago I actually changed to a software application called ON1, and I've tried a few different applications and they're all much of a muchness. I actually find ON1 to be a little bit slower than Adobe Lightroom. Now I used to have a Mac Pro 5.1 cheese grater. I had the 12-core version with a Titan X graphics card, and I used ON1 to edit my photos on that machine. And I have to say that this Mac Pro 6.1 is definitely a better experience. Whether or not the version increments of ON1 have improved things or not, I couldn't tell you, but certainly the experience that I've had editing photos is better on this trash cam. And given the fact that ON1 is typically slower than Adobe Lightroom, then if you're using Lightroom or any other app, I imagine that this computer would perform equally well in any of those applications. I've been playing around with some of my RAW files from various different cameras, and I've tried applying effects, applying LUTs, doing retouching, all sorts of different things, and I found it to be, great performance. It's easy to use, and it works really well. I'm really pleased with it. Working in Adobe Photoshop or Affinity Photo is just as quick. I've been using those apps to edit things, edit photos, and I've never found myself thinking that the performance wasn't good enough. Now, I'm by no means a professional graphic designer, and I'm probably not pushing these apps anywhere close to their limits, but certainly for me, I found that this computer does a great job. Now, I would have thought that the majority of professional photographers would get on just fine with the Mac Pro 6.1, because they have been using the Mac Pro 6.1 for many years and been getting on fine with it. And it's not like megapixel counts have dramatically changed over the years. Sure, just recently megapixel counts have started to increase, and maybe this computer isn't as cutting edge as it used to be, but I'd have thought it could still manage to edit those photos. If you're a very serious professional photographer and you're working full frame in very high megapixel counts, I'd imagine you probably wouldn't be looking at a machine like this anyway. So this is turning into a bit of a long video, and I need to wrap up my thoughts on this. We need to answer that original question that I posed. Does the Mac Pro 6.1 make sense for a professional user in 2020? I think we can answer that now, but the term professional user is very wide. I mean, the definition of professional is that somebody gets paid for doing something. And, a wedding photographer is a professional user. A software developer is a professional user. A video editor is a professional user. And all of these types of users have different requirements from their system. So what type of professional user is actually going to be able to use this kind of computer? I think it's fair to say that any professional who's working at the bleeding edge of technology is probably not going to find the Mac Pro 6.1 to be a good choice. For example, it's not really a good choice for serious video production. And when I say serious video production, I'm talking about the kind of professionals that need to use state-of-the-art equipment. These kind of users need powerful computers, and the Mac Pro 6.1 is not going to cut it. But price plays a big part in this. If money were no object, I don't think many people would be watching videos about older computers like this Mac Pro 6.1. And I don't think you would be looking at this particular Mac Pro if you had the money to go and drop on the new Mac Pro 2019. But I think most of us can't justify or just can't afford to spend the $5,000 or whatever it is for a new workstation. And Apple seems to have left this gap in its lineup where it just doesn't make a pro-grade machine with workstation-grade components and ECC RAM at a price point that most professionals can afford. The Mac Pro 2019 is just not aimed at the basic wedding photographer. It's not aimed at a software developer. It's not aimed at web studios. It's got a very niche market, and you've got to be able to afford or be able to justify the price of entry. Another aspect of price as well is the total cost of ownership. And this is a really important thing that a lot of people who criticize the Mac Pro 6.1 seem to conveniently forget. And that is that these things hold their value. In fact, since I started this video series, the average price of a Mac Pro 6.1 has gone up, not down. But when it comes to total cost of ownership, you need to look at the lifespan of the machine. How long are you going to keep the machine for? If I was buying a brand new Mac Pro, I'd expect it to last minimum 6 years. If I was buying a used Mac Pro, I'm kind of expecting 3 years out of this one. I think that's reasonable. If I was looking for something to last me 6 years, then I'm not going to buy a Mac Pro 6.1. It's just too old at this point in time. So I look at the 3 years as my period of ownership. I think about what I've spent to get the computer, and I think about what it might be worth at the end of 3 years. And I think I could probably still get somewhere between half and 2/3 of what I've paid for it in 3 years' time when I sell it on. So the actual cost for the Mac Pro is very low because of the fact that it holds its value. Now, you can go out and buy a PC workstation that's more powerful, but it's going to cost you a lot more because it won't hold its value. And I think that total cost of ownership needs to be a consideration. So having been through that process, I looked at what I've actually spent on this computer, and it comes to about £1,200 altogether, including the upgrades. Now, like I said, the price of these things seems to be going up. I think you'd be hard pushed to be able to do what I did for that amount of money right now. But still, that's my price of entry, and that's what it's cost me. When I come to sell the computer, I think I'll get between £600 and £800 back. So for me, this computer is costing me between £400 and £600. Now, if I can get 3 years use out of it, that makes a lot of sense to me. And in the process, I was then able to sell my iMac 27-inch. With the proceeds that I got from the iMac, I was able to buy the 4K display behind me. I was able to buy the Razer eGPU and also the 5700 XT graphics card that went in it. And I still had some change left over. That I spent on SSD upgrade and also the external SSD, which I made a separate video about on this channel. So for me, it's been great. I've been able to just kind of upgrade the system. That's been important to me. We've been building this new office that I'm sat in the garden. I wanted to have a really nice setup. I feel like I've achieved that, and I'm really happy with what I've got. That's the decision that I came to. The Mac Pro 6.1 is staying. That's going to be my main machine for my personal work. So doing things like YouTube, doing things like my music creation, editing my photos, and just general work, that's going to be my main computer. Overall, I'm comfortable with my decision, but I'm very aware that this is not a perfect setup for me. My perfect setup would be if Apple sold a new professional grade desktop computer that was upgradable, not on the scale of the Mac Pro 2019, in the region of say £3,000. That would be ideal for me. But Apple don't offer anything like that, so I'm kind of stuck in this situation. I have to say the overheating incident has really unsettled me, and it's going to take some time for this computer to win back my confidence. But it has been pretty reliable over the last couple of weeks when I've been using it, and we're starting to get to that point where I feel a bit happier with it now. Well, I think that's enough for this episode. It's turned into a bit of a long one, so if you've stayed with me all the way to this point, well done. It's not the end of my journey though. It's not the end of my journey with the Mac Pro 6.1. It's not the end of the Mac content I'll be putting on the channel. For starters, I'd like to make a video exploring the eGPU. A lot of people are curious about what the performance is like over Thunderbolt 2 and whether it's worth doing or not. Well, I hope to answer that for you. I'm also planning an episode where I answer some of your questions and respond to some of the comments that have been left over the course of producing these videos. So if you've got anything that you want to add to the conversation, please get typing below. I do read all of your comments. If you find my content useful or informative or enjoyable in any way, please consider subscribing. It brings a little ray of sunshine to my day when I see a new subscriber pop up. And at the point of recording this, I'm just below 1,000 subscribers. It'd be wonderful to get to that milestone. And thank you everybody that's supported me this far. And thank you for all your lovely comments as well. I'm overwhelmed by how kind people are in what they say to me about the content I'm producing. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please give it a thumbs up if you did, and I'll see you next time for some more geek